All right, fifth grade. Here we are back to chapter 11, my part two. I'm back. So, anyways, like I said, I kind of rambled on about the Cowboys, and I'm still going to ramble on about the Cowboys, not the football team because we're not too impressive right now, but just because I think it's a pretty neat part of our history here in Texas. So, some recommendations. If you've never been down to the stockyards, it's a pretty neat historical area to see. It's a lot nicer than it used to be about 20 years ago. It wasn't as touristy as it is now, which is a good and bad thing. But you can go down, you could actually see like a miniature cattle drive. They do, I think, like at 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock. There's a pretty neat museum in the stock exchange. A lot of people don't know about the SM Fort Worth history. It has some Native American stuff and things like that. Um, I'm trying to think what else. There's a military museum down there. Anyways, and then there's on the sidewalk if you're ever down there, like they have these stars of famous cowboys. Um, they have they have a spot, this place called the White Elephant Saloon that's still there, where you have had one of Fort Worth's like famous quick draw battles between Luke Short. I don't remember the other guy he had shot actually. Anyways, there's just some neat cowboy history down there, and there is at the museum, Amon Carter Museum too. So obviously you can't go right now, um, but if you ever get a chance, go see it because a lot of people don't go see this stuff in their own backyard. But it's kind of nice to see that. All right, moving on. So Cowboys, and then we're gonna talk about who sodbusters are, and then the homesteaders and Homestead Act. Sodbusters was kind of the nickname given to farmers on the plains. So you remember we talked about before. Our nation was settled from east to west, right? So you had east to west, and basically then it stopped at the Mississippi, and then people traveled and settled Oregon, Washington, California. But did they settle the middle part yet? No. So that kind of then was settled from both directions. And part of it was it wasn't really open to settlement. You still had a lot of natives. Part of it, the Civil War broke out. Part of it, it was not an easy way to live. So the Sodbusters was the name given to people that farmed on the plains. And sod, you understand, is grass and dirt. And sod is what they would use. They would use their steel plows, which vastly improved farming because steel is stronger than iron, but it was also lighter. It was easier to work with. And so these are the people that moved to areas where they broke up the sod basically and planted crops. These were your farmers on the plains. All right. They're also called homestead. You had a group of them called homesteaders because of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was passed actually by Lincoln to encourage people to settle these areas. So these are the areas like you had these plans. You had this available in South Dakota, North Dakota, um, not Oklahoma. That was Indian Territory. They called that, but like Nebraska, Kansas, Eastern Colorado, Montana. And so basically, what under the Homestead Act, you got it pretty much for free. Now you couldn't just go out there and hang out. Okay, so for 5 years you got it under the Homestead Act, and then you had to do these three things. Okay, one, improve it, and that could mean kind of anything. Basically, grow crops on it. Okay, two, build a house on it. Okay, you had to build a house. Okay, and then the third thing was then or no, wait, build a house and improve it. Yeah, that was it. Oh, and you had to pay a small fee then at the end of that 5 years, and that land was yours, and it was pretty cheap, pretty cheap. So this also, when you got your land, then you got your official government document that this was your acreage, and you could get up to 160 acres under the Homestead Act, okay, which was decent, which was a quarter of a section, what they called. But so this encouraged a lot of people to go west, cheap. They could get it in 5 years, and they had legal documentation that was theirs. Nobody could take it away. All right. So let's go to the next page, and we talk about farming and then ranches. So you understand the difference between farming and ranching. Farming is to me the growing of crops. And this is where you're going to have good soil. You're going to be able to grow crops. So, before we were talking about in the South had a lot of farming opportunities. Now, as people move farther west, the Midwest had very good soil as well. So, farming really started to expand because of people moving west. Now, ranches is where people were either raising sheep or cattle. Okay, and these are areas they had soil that was good enough maybe for some crops, but more like grassy areas, areas where they could have cattle graze, but the soil wasn't good enough really for farming. All right, and then the next part is your cattle kingdoms, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. You had some huge ranches that came about during this time. Um, One guy was named John Chisholm out of New Mexico. If you've ever heard of Charles Goodnight, Christian Foster actually did his project on Charles Goodnight, who was a rancher, pioneer out of Texas. He owned a lot of acres in northwest Texas and in New Mexico. Anyway, so this is where you had these cattle kingdoms just grow. Okay, and so that's why the cattle kingdoms were these guys are very powerful because of the amount of land they owned and then the money they had. Like I said, people back east wanted that beef, right? They wanted that meat. So it became very profitable to get in the cattle business during that time. Okay. Um, Go to the next part. So it's chapter 11, lesson 2, conflicts on the plains. And I have written down conflicts, who, what, where, why. Well, who's the biggest conflict with on the plains? Well, it's with Native Americans as we moved in, okay? As we moved into this area, as your quote, white settlers moved west, well, the problem is you still had natives that claimed those areas, all right? Different tribes that you had that I know you've talked about. We talked about some of them early on this year, but I know you've done that more like in third and fourth grade. But the Sioux tribe, the Cheyenne tribe, the Apache, Comanche, these are all tribes in the Wichitas. These were all the Pawnee. These were all Plains Indians that you know they didn't recognize land ownership like we do. So you did have problems with that. Um, so that was the who, right? So what? What were they fighting over? Well, land and hunting grounds, right? So as settlers moved in, more and more of the natives' hunting grounds went away. It shrank. And then it says where? Basically, the Midwest is what we're looking at. All the way, like I said, from Montana, the Dakotas, western Kansas, western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, into Wyoming, eventually into Arizona, New Mexico, especially the Plains Indians. And why? Well, it's over land, it's over hunting rights. Our government did pay many of these tribes for their land, but they were not fair deals. And Indians didn't, treat money like we did. It had really no value to them. So a lot of times it was for goods, um, agreements, which many times are broken by the natives and a lot of times broken by the U.S. Okay. Other conflicts, not just land, you had conflicts over certain areas. So one of the instances your your one of the instances your book talks about is what was called the Battle of Little Bighorn. And this came over basically in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which our government had actually told the Sioux and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne that you can have that. They considered that sacred ground. Well, guess what happened? Guess what was discovered there? Gold. Okay, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. So once word got out that gold was discovered, guess what happened? Okay, people started going there. The Indians did not want them in. The government did want to let people go in. So they actually sent in a guy named George Armstrong Custer, who had fought in the Civil War, but now was stationed out west. And where a lot of the army was now was to deal with what they called the Indian problem. So, anyways, you had a large battle at Little Bighorn. Uh, Custer was pretty confident when he came across a big native camp that he could defeat them. Well, it was bigger than he thought, and him and his men were all killed. And so, of course, this created outrage out east. And okay, what are we going to do with the Indians? Okay, so that leads us to the next part, the solutions. Okay, how are we going to deal with them? Okay, where are we going to put them? So um, there was two solutions. One, they offered land to the Indians, and they called that land they offered to them reservations, and the Indians could have that and live on that land. Does everybody understand? Which at first sounds pretty good idea. It was like, okay, we're going to quit fighting. You're going to have to live over here. The problem is, the problem is the land that they chose for them was not the best land. It was not good for growing things. It was not. It did not support good hunting. Which typically you remember what animal were the Plains Indians following? The buffalo. They followed the buffalo. So another solution was that they didn't want to go on the reservation. Well, the solution was to attack them and kill them. And then the third solution is that the government recognized is if we kill off the buffalo, then the Indians will go on the reservations because they won't have a food source. Okay, that was a key animal for their survival. So you had people just start shooting and killing buffalo, basically letting them lie except for their skins. They would these buffalo hunters would the skins were very popular back out east for clothing, for rugs, for coats. But they wasted the rest of the animal. Yeah, they didn't want the meat was popular for a while, but then people didn't want the meat. They wanted cattle. Okay, so those were the solutions to get rid of the Native Americans or get them on the reservations. So that took a period of time from like I said, basically after the Civil Wars, we moved west from 1865 till early 1880s, middle 1880s. Even a couple of tribes still resisted till 1890s, but it took a period of about 25 years, and then what they called the Indian Wars were over. They were on the reservation. They didn't have any place else to go, okay, to survive. Um, your book also references a place called Wounded Knee, where actually the soldiers in the area thought there was going to be an uprising by the tribe. There wasn't, and it was actually one of those blemishes on U.S. history, like we've talked about, which are a lot. Like I said, we've never said we're a perfect nation, but bad things happen, and you have to go back and it's like, okay, that can never happen again, or why was that done? Okay, well, one was what was the view of the natives by European, settlers. They considered them savages, right? Still, okay? They were not Christian people. They were not white people. Um, so you had a battle at Wounded Knee where you actually had most of the people that were killed were women and children and elderly people of the tribe. So, end game. What I mean by that is what I kind of just referenced actually 1865 to 1880, 1885, all the tribes, oh man, once again, allergy stuff in the garage. Sorry. The tribes were basically on reservations. They were either, dead on the reservations or some of them were in prison. Okay. But that's what ended, the Indian Wars. All right. That's what ended the Indian Wars on the plains. All right. So I'll stop that one and we'll go on to the next part.